I'm Jeremy Rosen. I'm Associate Director for Faculty here at the Tanner Humanities Center. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Author Meets Readers event with Danielle, Olden. But I want to begin by acknowledging that the land we gather on today, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and federal government, and we affirm the university's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. The Tanner Humanities Center aims to advance humanities exploration and engagement through academic research, educational enrichment, and public outreach. Our Author Meets Readers series aims to deep dive into the work of leading humanist scholars and to introduce readers to the work of College of Humanities faculty. We're very grateful to the Tanner family's multi-generational commitment to the center and its work. In addition to OC Tanner, I want to thank the College of Humanities, with special thanks to the Dean, Hollis Robbins, and the college marketing team, the R. Harold Burton Foundation, and Utah Humanities. I'd also like to thank the Humanities Center staff, Beth James, Administrative Director, Susan Anderson, Development Officer, Missy Weeks, our Marketing Coordinator. Without these folks, none of this would go as smoothly and you wouldn't be so well fed. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest today. In conversation with Dr. Olden today will be Leah Legrone. Dr. Legrone is an Assistant Professor of History and Public History Director at Weber State University in Ogden. She is originally from Laredo and completed her undergraduate degree from Texas A&M International before moving to Dallas to teach high school. Later, she graduated from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas with a PhD in history, focused on borderlands, labor, and gender studies in the early 20th century. Her research examines state legislation and the discourse on minimum wages for women, specifically the connections of sex work with low wages. Her current book project argues that the politics around race, morality, and the minimum wage for women drove conversations among labor politicians and progressive reformers about the future of white supremacy in Texas.
Sounds amazing.
Thank you.
Dr. Danielle Olden is an associate professor of history here at the University of Utah. She received her PhD from Ohio State University. Her research and teaching focus on U.S. history, U.S. West history, Chicano history, and race, though she is particularly interested in questions around Mexican-American racial formation and racial politics. Her first book, Racial Uncertainties, Making Americans, School Desegregation, and the Making of Race in Post-Civil Rights America, which we'll be discussing today, was published in fall 2022 and was awarded honorable mention for the 2023 Organization of American Historians James A. Rowley Prize for the best book dealing with the history of race relations in the United States, and just recently was awarded the 2023 Western History Association Robert G. Athern Award for the best book on 20th century American West. This award-winning book is all too relevant today, and I'm very excited to discuss it more. Please join me in welcoming Danielle and Leah.
So first, thank you for having me. Thanks, Danielle, for inviting me to come do this talk. I do want to start off by introducing the book, which I was very excited to read. It not only informs my own scholarship, but I'm using it in my Latinx class now. They had to unpack one of your quotes from the book in my class actually today. So Racial Uncertainties, Mexican-American School Desegregation, and the Making of Race in Post-Civil Rights America examines the complicated history, I feel like I should put it up, of race and Latine, but especially the proximity to whiteness as it pertains to citizenship status and how that helped drive these larger discussions of civil rights. The description of the book online, I think, was perfect. So, right, why reinvent the wheel? Mexican-American racial uncertainty has long been a defining feature of U.S. racial understanding. Were Mexican-Americans white or non-white? In the post-civil rights period, this racial uncertainty took on a new meaning as the courts, the federal bureaucracy, and local school officials, parents, and community activists sought to turn Mexican American racial identity into their own benefit. This is the first book that examines the pivotal 1973 Keys versus Denver School District Number 1 Supreme Court ruling and how debates over Mexican Americans' racial position helped reinforce the emerging tropes of colorblind racial ideology, which is very pertinent today. In the post-civil rights era, when overt racism was no longer socially acceptable, conversations we're still having, anti-integration voices utilized the indeterminacy of Mexican American racial identity to frame their opposition to school desegregation. That some Mexican Americans adopted these tropes only reinforced strength of colorblindness in battles against civil rights in the 1970s, which I think is a very timely book, and I'm glad that I have it. So I'm going to start the first question. Danielle, how did you come to your work on school desegregation and civil rights in Denver?
Yeah, this is this is a question I get a lot. So I'm from the Mountain West. It's partly personal, partly scholarly, as I think a lot of our work tends to be.
Absolutely.
So I'm from the Mountain West. I'm actually from Laramie, Wyoming, about 6 hours from here. But Denver is the closest sort of major metropolitan area. And I knew after doing so much of my graduate reading in modern US history that there's not a lot of scholarship about Denver, period. In modern American history, it's very focused on, if we're talking about like the South, it's like, you know, what's going on in Atlanta and Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And then if we're talking about the North, it's like, well, Boston and Detroit or New York City are really where the important spots are at. And I felt like there was a story to tell about the Mountain West. And so like so many dissertations and first book projects, I actually started off doing something completely different than the book that emerged. Well, then the dissertation and then the book. I started off wanting to do a project on women's history really in the Mountain West and how different groups, different racialized groups of women were engaging with civil rights politics in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. That's a really vague sort of general description of what I was doing, but I went out there in my first sort of foray into archival research and just discovered that there wasn't a lot to be found. There was some minutes that I found from organizations and things like that, but they just weren't very detailed. But what I did find on that very first archival trip was sort of the needle in the haystack, was this case, Keys versus School District Number 1, which is the school district in Denver. And having, again, read pretty extensively in modern US history and the law, I had never heard of this case before, which I come to find out is actually very, very important. It was the first Supreme Court case decided by the Supreme Court on a school desegregation case kind of outside the South. And so it actually set a nationwide precedent when in 1973 the court ruled that Denver was guilty of segregating students. So now all of these school districts around the country, not just in the South, could be found in violation of the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954. So I found the case. I went back to Columbus to sort of hash it out with my advisor, and we both decided that this was something worth pursuing. I read some of the legal decisions in the case, and I was immediately fascinated and drawn to the racial negotiations that were going on in the legal, in the decisions around Mexican American racial identity. And I was like, you know what, I haven't really heard about the role that Mexican Americans played in these very pivotal moments around school desegregation in the post-World War II period. And so that is what immediately caught my attention. And so that's kind of what got me. I went back into the archives in Denver, really started looking very thoroughly. I kind of ventured into legal history by accident.
Same. Like, what am I doing?
I still sort of say, yeah, my book is legal history, but I'm an amateur legal historian, I guess is what I'll say. But I became thoroughly enmeshed in the legal scholarship around what had been said. And I just found that even the legal scholarship hadn't really gotten to the bottom of sort of unpacking what this story had to say about the racial formation of Mexican Americans in this period. And so that's kind of the origins of how the project got started in terms of why focus on Denver, and then what got me in particular interested in Mexican American racial formation.
No, and I think that's I think that's fascinating. And I think what you've done here is help me process the same thing that was happening just decades earlier in the early or the late 19 teens into the 20s, because the same thing was happening in Texas with legal history, especially as it pertained to women and their access to what was then going around as the minimum wage law for women. But something that I was having trouble with thinking through was this proximity to whiteness. And I'm finding letters. There was one letter in particular from El Paso where a woman had written into a state congressman and said, can you clarify, are we white or are we not? And like they're asking for this clarification because of course they're white in the census. And then treated as non-white in society. So it's fascinating these, and LULAC is part of your book. To a degree, LULAC of course began in Texas,
which is, for folks who don't know, the League of United Latin American Citizens.
Sorry,
it's okay. Sort of first like big Mexican American civil rights organization.
And began in Texas, and one of their arguments, of course, is this proximity to whiteness, is that we're white, so we deserve these legal rights, these civil rights. But them, labor, both LULAC with the civil rights organization and labor organizations in Texas at the time used whiteness to try to gain political power, gain civil rights in Texas. And so I found that fascinating in your book on kind of that move, not outside of Texas, but into the 1960s.
Yeah, that's an important point, right? And so in the first part of the book, what I do is I trace this history of, how have Mexican Americans been racialized in the past? And the book is called Racial Uncertainties because people who really study this know that Mexican Americans are always racialized in different ways, depending on context, time and place specific. I mean, it can be like in East Texas, they could be racialized one way, and in West Texas could be racialized in a completely different way, right? And so this is what we mean when we say race is a socio-historical construction. And so what I do in the first part of the book is try to sort of trace that earlier 20th century history of Mexican American whiteness. And you're right, it really starts with civil rights organizing in the late 20s and 1930s and 1940s with groups like LULAC. The American GI Forum was another one of these organizations that fought for Mexican American veterans. They were both sort of really jumped on the whiteness bandwagon and were making arguments in society and in the courtroom. And in fact, they started with school desegregation cases in Texas. They said, you cannot segregate these Mexican children from white children because we're white too. Right? And that it becomes known as the, quote, other white argument. And that's what really guides Mexican American civil rights politics until the late 1960s, which is right at this moment where I come into the story. And so the legal history is really interesting because this case, there's a handful of others, several in Texas. Corpus Christi is like the big one. They're all dealing with this issue of segregation of Black students and Mexican American students at the exact same moment, right? And they're all trying to figure out how to solve this. And so the lawyers in Denver have come to the same conclusion as in Corpus Christi and in some other places, which is that, look, these school districts are segregating not just Black students. They're also segregating Mexican and Mexican American students. But we've been arguing for years that they're white, and that hasn't really worked for us, right? The courts didn't, I won't get into the complications of all that, but basically is they don't really win any civil rights by trying to argue the other white argument. And so by the late 60s, they're starting to rethink this strategy. And largely this is influenced by the rise of the Chicanx movement, right? The Chicano movement in the mid to late 1960s is growing, it's gaining adherence, and the young people, especially within the movement, are very much opposed to sort of older racial understandings, older understandings about their own identity. And they're moving away from saying we're white And instead they're claiming a distinct like brown or mestizo or Chicano identity, right? More akin to their indigenous ancestors. And that's central to the politics of the movement. And that is really playing a large part in informing these new legal strategies. However, the other really important thing here, not just the movement, but there's a critical change in the law that happens in the 1960s. And that's the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ends legal discrimination in jobs and schools and public accommodations. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, which says you cannot stop people from voting based on race. So these are like, these are civil rights milestones. And because that law has changed, Jim Crow is now over in the South, right? So before, part of the whiteness argument was, well, we're not powerful enough to challenge Jim Crow, so we'll just say we're on the white side of the color line, right? Now Jim Crow is over. It doesn't mean legal discrimination is necessarily over, right? But that we have a law now that is supposed to protect us. And that too, in addition to the rise of the movement, is shaping how people are starting to rethink, okay, how can we now use the courts now that we have legal protections for race that are being recognized? And so in Keys, what the lawyers do is they construct Mexican Americans as, quote, minority. And they group together Black and Mexican American students together in the minority category. And they say, their argument in court is, Denver is guilty of violating the Brown v. Board of Education decision because they are creating Anglo schools or majority white schools and minority schools, majority minority schools, where there are Black and Mexican American students together, right? And so when the school district tries to defend themselves against that, they try to say, well, we've never used the category minority before. We don't even know where this category came from. And plus, Mexicans are white.
Yeah, right.
So, and it's like, well, they've been arguing that for decades. So it's actually kind of difficult to overcome that legal precedent that they are white, which is set so early in the 1930s with groups like LULAC.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like in Texas, once the, Brown v. Board is 1954, but then you have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But Texas schools don't really start desegregating for the most part until the 1970s.
Right.
And then you get, of course, the white academies that branch off from that to subvert or circumvent desegregation. And then the redlining and all of that comes in to Texas cities to try to maintain that segregation. So what I thought was really interesting in your book is the talk about urban geography specifically, and the racialized urban geography of Denver in the 1960s and 70s. And can you talk more about that and what that means for your readers in 2023, the parallels that you're seeing, but also, how those politics of urban geography fed into this desegregation talk?
Yeah. So, I think it's important so I spent a whole chapter on this early in the book, sort of laying out the racialized urban geography of the city, because it's really important to understand not just the legal arguments that are made in the courtroom, but kind of the social response to what is happening in the courtroom and in the school district. So why I think it's so important to lay that out historically is because so much of the opposition to school desegregation in the 1970s is framed around colorblindness, right? And so the arguments become basically what happens in the post-World War II period is there's a whole host of things happening to segregate cities. Redlining, white flight, disinvestment in the urban cores, defunct urban housing authority situations, right? So we come to this situation by the 1960s where metropolitan America is very segregated, and it's segregated intentionally. It's not by accident, okay? It was created through specific policies and practices that have been implemented to create this segregation. And so by the 1970s, when we're in these school desegregation cases and the plaintiffs are trying to say, hey, the school districts have helped to perpetuate this segregation problem, the response is always, But there's nothing in the law, like in the South, that says we have to have separate schools. The only reason we have segregated schools now is not because we did it on purpose, it's just because of economics, that people live where they can afford to live, and so they go to schools in their neighborhood, right? And so it's largely economic, which is not against the law, or it's personal preference, right? People just want to live where they want to live, and sometimes they want to live amongst people of their own race, right? And they're perpetuating these colorblind arguments like freedom of association and freedom of choice. And so they say, I have a right as an American to live where I want and to send my kid to school where I want. And there's nothing in the law that says I can't do that. And I'm not racist by saying that. These are the origins of colorblindness, right? And so the job of these lawyers in a lot of these cases is to try to fight. It's very, very hard to fight against that. Because with Jim Crow outlawed, so much of structural institutional racism is hidden, right? And so much of their case has to unpack those hidden practices and policies that the school districts have implemented to manufacture segregation. And it's very difficult. What ends up happening is, long story short, the Supreme Court, by 1973, essentially, and it's the same year as Keyes, which is why it's very interesting. But they rule, sorry, I'm getting the years. In the Milliken case, the Milliken v. Bradley case, they rule that you cannot you cannot bus students, right, from the white schools to the black schools and the black schools to the white schools. You cannot cross school district lines, right? And that when they make that ruling, and one of the reasons they make that ruling is because they say, again, is because there's no proof that this has been done intentionally, right? And so it's very hard to overcome that Supreme Court presumption of these people being largely innocent of creating these, of creating urban segregation, right? So it's the job of the historian, I think, to lay out why segregation exists, right? It was a historical process whereby people were making specific decisions, implementing specific policies to create segregation. None of it was by accident. No one is necessarily innocent, right? And so I think it's important to lay that out early on in the book, so that the arguments, the colorblind arguments that come later kind of make more sense.
Well, can you talk more about what colorblind means, especially in today's discourse around it? And speaking of the Supreme Court, with so much of the spotlight having been on the Supreme Court in recent years, months, especially with this decision to overturn affirmative action, and colorblindness coming back into this discourse. Can you talk about that and how your work adds to the discourse on race justice in the Supreme Court in 2023?
Yeah, so first of all, colorblindness is just basically the argument that race doesn't matter in America anymore. That it's kind of like, yes, we once had slavery and we once had Jim Crow,
but I don't see color anymore.
Yeah, but we've ended those things. And so race doesn't matter anymore, right? And so there's the literal color blindness, like I personally don't see color, right? But there's the bigger argument, which is simply that race just doesn't matter anymore. And that really starts, there have always been kind of colorblind arguments throughout the entire 20th century, but it really becomes a part of resistance to civil rights in this late 1960s, 1970s moment. And it's largely in response to the successes of the civil rights movement in school desegregation, and then affirmative action is the other really big one that comes into play in the 1970s. And so a big trope of colorblindness is the reverse discrimination argument, which is that I've done nothing wrong. Why are you punishing me by not hiring me to give this other person a leg up just because they're Mexican American, right? And we see this exploding in the 1970s and has really become what other scholars argue and what I argue in the book is that colorblindness essentially replaces Jim Crow
Right.
as the legal racial paradigm in which we currently operate. And in terms of the court, the courts were kind of wishy-washy at first, sort of supporting school desegregation efforts and affirmative action early on. This starts to break down a bit, even as early as the 1970s, even more into the 1980s, and especially in the 1990s, whereby the first decade of the 21st century, we get a Supreme Court where we have a plurality of the court in the early 2000s that believes in the ideology of colorblindness. It took a couple decades for the court to get a plurality on that matter. So we now have a court, and this really, the first big case is a school desegregation case, 2008. It's a big case that joins together a couple of different school districts in Lexington, Kentucky, and I'm forgetting the other ones right now, North Carolina maybe, where the parents are trying to get some sort of school desegregation, because what largely happens is a lot of these cases win in the 1970s. The courts give up on these cases by the 1990s. They release all of these school districts around the country from court oversight. They almost immediately resegregate. So that today the schools are actually more segregated
Absolutely.
than they were in the 1960s. And this is especially true in the US West, where Mexican Americans and other Latinxes are the most likely to be segregated, along with Black students. And increasing numbers of Black and Mexican American students are being put together, just like they did in Denver today. And so that's what you're likely to see today. But as I said, a plurality on the court developed by 2008. They issued this decision in 2008 in this case called Parents United. And what Chief Justice John Roberts basically says is, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. That's a quote.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, like, I'm just like Martin Luther King, right? And I want to live in a world where my children are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so we have to take race completely out of the equation, right? We should not consider race at all, ever, in any of these issues. It needs to be taken out. And that is where the court is at right now. It's even worse now than it was in 2008 with these attacks on affirmative action. And I have no faith at all that any remnant of affirmative action will be left within the next 5 years.
Right.
And what's really interesting is a lot of what I talk about in the book is so much of colorblindness is, again, built on the idea that race doesn't matter, but also on the idea that racial classification itself is a fraught process because race is so uncertain. And particularly these racially ambiguous groups like Mexican Americans, right? How can we tell if they're of color or not? Are they white? Are they non-white? You know, because why are we giving benefits, special privileges to these people who are actually white? For opponents of civil rights, that actually proves why they're right, right? And so they start using these arguments. They start using Mexican-American racial uncertainty to argue against the desegregation remedy, right? By pointing out that race is arbitrary. And there are literally parents that go before the Denver School Board. They put up pictures of their children who are mixed race Mexican-American children, and they're like, what are they? And the school board members, they just kind of look at each other like, what is this? And she's like, yeah, and she goes through and she says, the school district marked each of my children in a different way, right? This one was marked as Hispano. This one was marked as Hispano because their last name is Romero. This one was marked as other because their father is white. And this one was marked as white because their skin is very light-skinned. And so she's telling the school board, like, look, you guys can't even tell what race my kids are, so how can I trust you to racialize all of these Mexican Americans? And why that's important is because you can't create a desegregation plan without first racializing each student and saying this is where they need to be placed in the plan. So they're using racial uncertainty as a weapon to oppose a civil rights remedy. And that is, I think, what is really interesting about where my book concludes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, I see that Texas scholars and other scholars as well are starting to, or have been, and more so now, calling this moment Juan Crow.
Oh, yeah.
And talking in those same kind of terms from Jim Crow and Juan Crow and these segregate, like, do you see any of that in because what comes up is this Chicano movement that is this political ideology as well, that you need to reclaim your reclaim your identity, but also kind of call out
Yes.
the systemic racism that Mexican Americans experience. Do you see them at the time talking about Juan Crow in those terms, or calling out other types of systemic racism outside of desegregation, school segregation?
So in regards to Juan Crow, I'm sort of in agreement with some of the critiques of this construct. So Juan Crow is supposed to be like the Latinx version of Jim Crow.
Right.
Like, so in a place like Del Rio, Texas, or something like that, where there really aren't any Black people, it's like there's a system that keeps Anglos from Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Let's call this Juan Crow.
Yeah, Texas historians love to do that, by the way.
Yeah. But I'm find myself more in agreement with some of the critiques of this construct, because Mexican Americans and other Latinxes are never racialized in isolation of other groups.
Right.
And so there's no such thing as a Juan Crow system that exists outside of Jim Crow. These things are operating together. And so that's why I think seeing the process of racial formation as relational is so important, and that's what I do in the book. I mean, Mexican Americans are always racialized against whites, of course, but also Blacks.
Right.
And that's how we determine what they are, is seeing what they are not. Well, are they more like this group, or are they more like this group? And it's always relational, right? And so I see systems of segregation as always relational as well. But in terms of our Mexican Americans in Denver calling out systemic racism, absolutely, right? Denver is actually like a center of the Chicanx movement in this era. There's a major organization called the Crusade for Justice. Its very famous leader, Rudolfo Corky Gonzalez, becomes famous nationally. He becomes one of the big sort of male Chicanx leaders of the movement. And they're doing a lot in the city. One of their biggest issues is the issue of police violence and police brutality, and it's anti-Mexicanness and anti-Blackness. Right. So they're really pushing that issue. Interestingly, they're not really involved in school desegregation. And this is part of my book as well, is that not all Mexicans American in Denver wanted school desegregation. Many of them actually wanted to stay like in their community schools, because then they could implement what they wanted, which was bicultural education. And for them, they said that's what would be the best for them, not necessarily desegregation. So the Crusade is they actually march into school board meetings and denounce the desegregation plans in pretty flashy ways. And so there's the police brutality. They're challenging housing discrimination as systemic in the city as well. Those are sort of the big three, is sort of around the schools, housing, and police brutality.
So, a fun question. Was there a story that you found in the archives that didn't make it into the book that really stood out to you? Yeah,
there's I don't know if there's one single story, but there's a couple of people who were absolutely fascinating to me in the historical record. And they do show up in the book, but not as extensively as the evidence I found. Like, they could have been more, I guess a lot of the stuff I found wasn't relevant for the book, which is why it didn't make it in the book. But it encouraged me to develop my second book project. So
that's always good.
Yeah, there were two Mexican Americans, one of whom was the first Mexican American school board member. But he was one of these people who opposed school desegregation, and he joined the anti-busing movement. And he's absolutely like, no, I am white, I am Hispano, my ancestors are from Spain, not from Mexico. And I get into all of that in the book too. And so he's kind of that perspective. And so that feeds his anti-desegregation politics. He goes on to become the highest ranked Mexican American in the Nixon administration. And so his political career continues. And he goes into work in the Office for Equal Opportunity, and he works on the war on poverty, trying to sabotage it largely because he's conservative. And then there's another woman who actually is in my book quite a lot, Naomi Bradford, who has who is Mexican American, and she is on the school board as well, and she is adamantly opposed to school desegregation. She's also adamantly opposed to bilingual education. So she's she's very conservative as well. After her stint on the school board, she goes on to try to run for a seat in Congress as a Republican. She never wins, but her political career continues. And so I became fascinated with these Mexican American conservatives in the city, and their racial politics were central to their conservatism. And so that is why my second book is going to be about Mexican American conservatives.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes, which is in its early stages now.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, being from Laredo, there's just a huge group of Latinx conservatives in South Texas. And so I found some of this fascinating because those same discussions are there. Assimilation, even
Don't speak Spanish
at all. Even my mother-in-law, who only speaks Spanish, didn't want my son to speak Spanish. For that, I'm like, but he's mixed race and bilingual. I want him to be bilingual. And but there's still, that deep conservative understanding of what it means to have Mexican identity and what it means to have American identity. American being equated to whiteness. And how to live in that duality, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Especially living in a border city like I did. A little bit about Laredo. There's one of the most affluent neighborhoods in Laredo is called the Plantation. And one of the things I think Danielle and I were talking about one time was, so one of the big celebrations in Laredo is George Washington celebration. And they do this ceremony. So you have old money in Laredo, usually very light-skinned people who are in Laredo, and they dress up in these incredible costumes to look like George and Martha Washington, which is nuts in itself, right? And this, of course, started in 1896, once you get the railroads through, and the affluent Mexican Americans are trying not to be labeled bandits by the Texas Rangers and retain their land. And so they start really proclaiming their whiteness and their Americanness and the sameness of both and their duality. But there's a ceremony in Laredo, which I kept thinking about as I read your book, especially with these discussions on race. And George and Martha Washington, dressed up, walks out onto the bridge, and it's called abrazos on the bridge, so hugs on the bridge. And you have this young boy that's usually dressed in a sombrero and a poncho.
I'm like shuddering at what's coming.
I know. And a young girl that's in her embroidered dress. And they walk out onto the bridge. George and Martha Washington walk out of the bridge. They hug, and then they go back.
They're separate ways.
It's symbolic of these brown children going back to Mexico. And George and Martha Washington, which are usually Latinx people, but blonde hair, blue-eyed, light skin, going back to the United States. And so there's that divide. And I kept thinking about that while I was reading your book, because it's so, those questions of proximity to whiteness, how that is how that's used, especially in the middle and upper class Mexican American community, and separating themselves definitely with the middle and upper class from the working class Mexican Americans.
Yeah.
What was happening in Laredo. And you can even see it in Laredo now. A lot of people will talk about Laredo as not being racialized. Like it was more about class than race. And I'm like, no. Race was a big part of it because class, your color did kind of indicate class. Yeah. And so you still have those divides in Laredo where it's north of Del Mar, Calle Del Mar, and then south of Calle Del Mar is working class Mexicans and new immigrants from Los Dos Laredos, so Nuevo Laredo, and then the upper old money.
Yeah.
And
people are fascinated with how that situation came to be.
Yeah.
And so part of what I say is that understanding modern Mexican American racial identity and racial politics means that we have to go back to the colonial period. We have to go back at least to the 19th century
absolutely.
To understand the Spanish role in the area and how so many of these people came to identify as Spanish or akin to European whites as opposed to Mexicans. And so again, that's what I sort of do in the first part of the book.
And that's why I think that was part of my favorite part of the book, especially as you bring in the Chicanx discussion and in Denver. Yeah. Because I'm a Texas historian, I try not to be like Texas exclusive or, Texas exceptionalism. But I was like, Denver, yes,
same exact thing,
same exact thing that you're seeing, and this kind of open area that we don't really, or I haven't, full disclosure, because you think about Texas and then scholarship goes to California. Right? Mm-hmm. And so you have this kind of big open area with Denver right there in the middle. And so I just found that fascinating to take those discussions that we've been having in Texas and California around civil rights for Mexican Americans and centering that in a West city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is fascinating, and I hate to
no, you're good.
so fast, but I think we'd love to take some questions from the audience if you guys are willing. Great. Please.
Hi, my name is Elias Strados. I'm a second year PhD student, and basically this is just within my area of studies. I'm really interested in kind of reading about this, and I've only gotten through the intro so far. I'm very much hooked on this. So I'm kind of curious about more of those other stories that you pointed out that are kind of lost in the archives and don't really make their way, especially the stories of probably Latinas and Chicanas, especially within the purview of history with the Chicana movement. So I was wondering if you found anything that kind of pointed at the ways that, if anything, probably just the roles of Latinas and Chicanas in terms of mobilizing either in the legal circles or even outside.
Yeah, that's a great question. If I would have stuck only to the legal records, and the main lawyer, the primary lawyer in the case was this guy named Gordon Greiner. He was this big wig, a partner in this big law firm in Denver. They ended up donating all of the stuff related to it's humongous. It's like hundreds of boxes. I mean, this case went to 1995, so this case went decades. And they donated it all to the University of Colorado Boulder. If I would have just stuck to that archive, I would have missed pretty much the entire story about Mexican Americans in this case. They literally are only in the documents as statistics, as like data points to use in the courtroom to say there's this many Mexican Americans at this school and this many Mexican Americans in the district. They don't really show up as primary players, although interestingly, there is a Mexican American woman and her 3 children listed as one of the original plaintiffs. And she wasn't in any of the legal scholarship I read about the case. She's not in the archive I just talked about. I literally found her I finally found her daughter on Facebook. and messaged her on Facebook, and her daughter was more than happy to talk to me about her mother, and she had all these great stuff to talk about, and she gave me photos. That's how I got a photo of her in the book. No one had ever written about her before, and she's like this major player in this school desegregation case, and it's like, well, what was she thinking? So I found out you have to go beyond, to get these stories, you really have to go beyond the central archives, the main archives that people would think of when you look at a Supreme Court case like this. And I was lucky because the archivists at the Denver Public Library have been amazing in the last decade since I started the dissertation at requesting, going out and actually talking to people in the community and getting newer archival material donated. When I started the dissertation, and even by the time I was done with the dissertation, I didn't have a lot on some of these people I ended up talking a lot about in the book. It was only because once I was revising the dissertation years later that those new documents had been donated, because those librarians were like, we're going out there, we need these. And so there were 3 different collections that were brand new, had not been processed at the archive yet. They were literally just boxes of craps, like thrown in boxes. And so I just had to like surf through all of this stuff to find the stories. So it was pretty arduous, and I won't sugarcoat it for you. Getting those stories can be very difficult. And I actually wish I had had time, but I had to get tenure. I really wanted to do some more oral histories with people. A lot of folks had already passed away, but there were some I could have talked to, and I wish I would have had time to do that. So I recommend that as well, if that's the type of work you're interested in.
Absolutely.
CJ.
I'm CJ Alvarez. I teach in Latino Studies at the University of Texas.
We've read your work in my class.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well,
Absolutely.
this is so fascinating, and I haven't had a chance to look at the book, but I'm super excited after the talk today, and I just want to hear your thoughts about a couple things. So I think there's this way that when outside, the sort of the niche conversations, when we talk about Mexican American segregation, there's the assumption that everyone of Mexican descent was segregated in the Southwest.
Yeah.
That wasn't at all the
Absolutely
case.
not. Yeah.
And so it wasn't at all the case by state, which is part of the reason that Texas is the worst case scenario, still is, in a lot of ways. But also just by class, and so there's plenty of people who don't fit into that. And what's fascinating to me about that is, and this is what I want to hear you say more about, is the linguistic aspect. Like oftentimes we talk about race in Mexican America, we're not really, we're talking about a proxy for language and people who don't speak English, which is also then the justification for segregation
Absolutely.
in these cases.
Yeah.
But the irony is that the early organizations like LULAC you were talking about were Spanish only in a lot of cases, or Spanish dominant. Those are considered now this is the conservative people making the case for citizenship, even though Spanish was just much more ubiquitous in Mexican America back then. I'm guessing, not knowing the Denver case, that it's a much more recent immigrant population than a lot of the multi-generation populations in Texas and certainly New Mexico, where I'm from, full disclosure, which is where everything is,
So
works.
Denver is, the Mexican Americans in Denver are the ones in New Mexico. There's a migration flow.
From the San Luis Valley
Yes.
going up. Okay.
Well, no, more from from northern Mexico, southern Colorado, up to. Yeah.
So where's language in all of
Yeah.
this? Where does that fit in?
It's interesting because you're right. In a lot of the early LULAC cases, the courts end up saying, you can't segregate Mexican American white children from other white children, but you can segregate them because they speak Spanish and they're not going to do well in this classroom with English speakers. And so that becomes like a proxy, as you said. And so that's one reason why the other white argument never works, is because they can always fall back on language. It's interesting because in Denver, the issue of language is different than in a place like Texas and in a place like Southern California, because the vast majority of folks are third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation. There are some more recent migrants that have come up in the last since the post-World War II period. But even then, most of them come from Texas or other parts of New Mexico. There's a small number of Mexican nationals. So the issue of language is more around, we want bilingual education, not because we have so many people who are only dominant Spanish speakers, But because we have all of these Chicanx students who have never learned their language.
Right.
And so it becomes a matter of reinforcing like cultural pride and heritage rather than like a means to, I've lost my train of thought. It just becomes more of like we want our children to learn Spanish because they are Mexican American, not that they're only Spanish speakers and they need to learn English. That said, what becomes really interesting is later on in the case, as the case progresses into the 1980s, this language issue becomes much more crucial because many more people are coming into Denver from Mexico during the 1980s. And so this does become an issue. And interestingly, so many Vietnamese refugees in the 1980s as well. And so the school district starts to say, hey, we have too many languages here. You can't expect us to be teaching bilingual education to all of these different people. And so that's how they start arguing against it. But back to your sort of first comments, no, there was never sort of this like all Mexican Americans are segregated. And that's part of what I trace in the chapter about the racialized urban geography is that it really depends on class, color, sometimes on language, on what you do for a living, which really has to do with class. And there's all of these instances where confidential studies are done by groups like the Denver Commission on Community Relations. Will do like a confidential study and they'll talk to realtors and people in the real estate business to try to get a sense for how they are, like why is there so much segregation? And they say all of these things in confidence, like, well, you can't rent to a Mexican. You know, there's nothing written in law or anything, nothing written in our policies. We just know that you can't do it. And these are called gentlemen's agreements. But they also say things like, you know, once I placed a Spanish family in this neighborhood and the community retaliated, you know, they came at me really hard and said, this is a white neighborhood. You can't place this family, this Mexican family here. And his response was, that's no Mexican. Like that is a full-blooded Spaniard. And his family deserves to live where they want, right? So they're using this, again, Spanish whiteness argument for some people who can pass, right, in terms of their class and color. They are more integrated into the community and are able to live in areas that are largely closed off to the vast numbers of like poor and working class Mexican Americans. So it's definitely a more complicated story. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the school district, that's one of the arguments the school district makes, is that Mexican Americans live all over the city and they go to all of these different schools. So how can you say we're segregated?
Yeah.
Right?
I taught bilingual math and Spanish in New Jersey for some time and had students from 17 different countries or territories. And I know that there are a few thousand Puerto Ricans here, which range from visibly Afro-Puerto Rican to other stuff. And so you've been talking about Mexican Americans, and I know there are lots of Central Americans, and you know, I've been really surprised by the Caribbean and Dominicanos and everything. And so I wonder how that fits in with any of the stuff you're
Yeah, so it's there aren't large numbers of other Latinxes in Denver in this period. There are now.
Yeah.
Certainly there are now. But there's other scholarship that has been written, say, about Puerto Ricans in New York City. There's some great stuff about school desegregation efforts there. And what's really interesting there is Puerto Rican activists and Black activists agree to work together.
Yeah.
And agree that they are treated as people of color, right? And so there aren't this large group of Puerto Ricans saying, well, actually, we're white, even though there are a lot of Puerto Ricans who claim to be white, right? So they make different choices. And not because they're Puerto Rican, but it's just because of the different context, right? They make different choices than the people in Denver do, which I think is part of why I think the Denver story is interesting. But there's certainly lots of other scholarship. I'm trying to think of other examples.
I'm trying to think of other examples too, because I know that there's some people working on Puerto Ricans in Texas. There was a large population of Puerto Ricans in Corpus Christi, and then of course in Dallas. And I'm not a scholar of the civil rights, that 60s and 70s civil rights era, but I know that there's some scholarship that some friends of mine have been working on of Puerto Ricans trying to differentiate themselves from Mexican Americans during these time periods and claim more of their Americanness.
As American citizens.
As American citizens.
Yeah.
As American citizens, but to do that, like you were talking about the otherness and what I am what I am because of what I'm not. And so they're claiming that Americanness because of their citizenship, but trying to distance themselves from Mexican Americans, which then, of course, leads to more of this social construction of all Mexican Americans being immigrants,
Right.
whereas Puerto Ricans are not.
Yep.
And
Insiders and outsiders.
Yeah, insiders and outsiders. And so I know that there's some scholarship. There's still like in dissertation or post dissertation. So
Yeah, I'll
I'm
just
hoping
say
that it comes out. But I think that's a really great question.
I think just to summarize, like there's things you can say that are the same across Latinxes, right? But there's also so many things that are different. And so that's why I think speaking in terms of Latinx as a whole group, like
Yeah.
as a monolithic group in modern politics can be really problematic.
Absolutely. We're talking about that in my class right now too, because I have Central Americans, I've got Puerto Ricans, I've got Mexican Americans. This one young woman, she's actually third generation, but from a Peruvian family, which is much different. And since this is they voted. I let them vote in class on the identity experience question, and so we say Latine in class now. Latine experience, even though the class is named Latinx experience, because it's so culturally diverse, and we debated the X term, and so they were like, "Can we please be Latine?" And so that's what we're doing. But I find that because I told them the experience is not monolithic and a monolith, and so those are really important discussions, I think, moving forward.
And the regional Mexican differences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Tamaulipas is so much different than being in the West, where I am, where my third year at Weber State. The experience for me is much different than a border city in Texas.
Well, great. I think that's probably a really good place to end the conversation on racial uncertainties. Before we give our guests a round of applause, I'd just like to announce thank you for coming and announce a couple upcoming Tanner Humanities Center events. We have the fiction editor Carmen Maria Machado coming October 5th to UMFA. We are sold out for that, but please do register if you haven't already for the wait list. We usually do get everybody in the wait list in. We have David Wallace Wells, a climate journalist from the New York Times, coming October 24th, and visual artist and activist LaToya Ruby Frazier coming on November 14th. When people give us their presence, their intellectual camaraderie, and great conversation at the Tanner Humanities Center, we like to give them a gift. We have some tote bags here.
Yes.
There's Danielle and Rita.
You can never have too many tote bags.
Never
I wore
have.
my red today. So
You can put books in there. You can put your cultural baggage.
There's a lot.
Uncertainties in there.
Yep.
Please join me in giving a hand for our